now. All right, so this is number 4 after nearly month-long thing because of weird scheduling things, right? Anyway,
Yeah.
we are back with a vengeance. This is E-Politeia 4 Revengeance, the best Metal Gear Solid game, I may add. We are here talking about,
Well,
the
problems of we're talking today about certain problems concerning, again, negative elements within polytheistic communities. We've talked a bit about the problems of pseudo-atheists or pseudo-polytheists who are in truth atheists, and that's a problem in and of itself. But today we kind of hope to hit a little bit upon another problem within polytheistic communities you tend to find is many polytheists are operating under very, very new age frameworks, and a framework that's nothing more than an attempt to negate Christianity rather than a legitimate attempt to hit at a fundamental truth.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today.
Yeah. It's either... don't you might want to lean back a little bit. And just a tad bit from your end. But anyway, it's... there's definitely the problem, right? Where you've got these people that will just offhandedly reject almost any theology.
Yeah.
Which is, that's bad enough. But then there's like these people, right, who, will adopt nearly correct theology.
They will, they'll adopt some level of theology. And Demo, by the way, who's our guest today.
Yes.
This is all rather informal. Jump in at any point. By the way. So we have a special guest today. Yeah.
Which is...
Yes. No, continue. You were saying about pseudo-religious people and more honestly religious people. I don't know. I think that there are more pseudo-religious people than there are honestly religious people out there.
I think I'd have to be in agreement with that one. I suppose, though, in some degree, though, I am rather charitable. I extend some acceptance of the supposed, at least, religiosity of these. How do I put? We don't really have a good term for this, but if someone, even having adopted an incorrect theology, maintains regular religious action and attempts at piety, I accept as their religiosity to be legitimate, even if I don't accept their religious practice as necessarily legitimate.
But would you say that this would go so far as to extend to, fraudulent traditions, such as Christianity or Scientology?
I accept the religiosity of the practitioners, not the legitimacy or the veracity of their theology. But I do accept that I think many Christians, at least, and Scientologists even, at the very least, believe in what they do. And I believe them when they tell me that they believe in it.
Well, I'm not doubting that they believe it.
That's what I'm getting at, though, is that I don't doubt that many pagans and polytheists who adopt wrong thinking about the gods are still legitimate in their belief of the gods, even if their theology and their reasoning around it isn't necessarily correct.
Yes, but I think that the difference I'm trying to get at is if you hold wrong opinions about the true gods, that's quite different from believing in gods that don't exist, false gods.
I see. And that's an interesting distinction. Could you expand on that a bit, perhaps?
Yes. If you direct your attention to the gods through any medium, even insofar as an atheist visits the Louvre and sees the statues of Zeus and Apollo and Venus and whatnot and feels something, that is a real connection to a real divine force. Whereas, a monk endlessly praying to Jesus, Jesus is a man. He may have been a very nice man, but a man that will not connect you to anything. And how much you believe in it, it's just a dead end. It doesn't connect to the divine.
I see what you're getting at then, and I think that raises an interesting point then. And we may, in some ways, taking it from that angle, we may in some ways say that a polytheist who holds incorrect opinions about the true gods is in fact doing more harm, at least perhaps to themselves, or is committing greater evil than someone completely ignorant of the divine gods.
Could be argued, yes. Depends how atheistic they are, I'd say, but atheistic in the sense of my thing is I blame everything on materialism. So
yes, I mean, well,
that's my shtick.
All things are kind of at the root. All bad things are necessarily materialistic, because that which is of the spiritual is only good. So its opposite must naturally be the source of the bad.
Yes,
and I think that so the degree to which this conversation was spawned, it was spawned in reaction to, and I'm not going to name names here for sake of some amount of decency. There was a post that I saw on the hellscape that is Twitter that was talking about that one of their positives towards polytheism versus Christianity was that they found that the gods as depicted in the myths, taken literally as these imperfect deities who are just trying their best but aren't perfect, is to them preferable to the perfect God as presented by the Christian religion. And this is kind of the nonsense that spawned this talk. And perhaps in some ways then we might say that the result of this amount of wrongthink that we often see in polytheistic communities is at its core the result of centering some amount of literally anthropocentrism over the divine.
Yeah, I mean, well, and to touch upon what Tartine said in the chat about the Truman Show and essentially making somebody believe a fictional character is a god, I think they're essentially these people aren't worshipping the gods. They're worshipping essentially a fictional character in practice. That they're essentially atheists.
So you don't think we should afford them a little bit more room then?
I think that we shouldn't really be charitable towards them, to be honest, because it's one thing to believe the myths and just say, oh, well, that's just a demo. Can you just a suggestion to go to push to talk, because we're getting a lot of feedback.
Sorry.
Yeah, but it's one thing to believe the myths and think, oh, they're just true, and that's just the manner of things. But it's another thing to go and say that these less charitable visions of the gods are not merely true, but also good. And
that's a fairly evil thing as well.
Yeah, it's you've essentially you're not worshipping a god anymore. You've now gone to worshipping just a big, powerful human. Might as well just be a wizard. Though I guess a major religion is essentially that.
Well, a few of them at this point.
Yeah, actually, that doesn't really narrow it down. But it's certainly, I would say it is functionally as bad as atheism.
Okay.
Maybe worse, because it brings people astray. So that I don't want to start arguing like, oh, lesser, greater evils, because you know
Of
me,
course.
I'm all about there's no such thing as a lesser evil. All evils are equivalent.
Yes, in essence, yeah. There's no degree of evil. That would describe a very strange ontology to evil.
Yeah.
But to that extent, then, as we've kind of wholesale thrown from the rafters, as it might be said, the Apollonian and Vargas types who are out and out self-admitted atheists, might I add, can we say of these wrong-thinking pagans, are they more savable?
I would say certainly. Even though it is practically worse because it is leading people astray, they still at least buy into the understanding that there are gods and they could be educated correctly. I mean, just as the Hellenes, no doubt, before Plato, Pythagoras, Orpheus, and all that, were misunderstanding, they were still brought to a correct understanding later on. But it is impossible to bring somebody who disbelieves the notion altogether without destroying their worldview.
Well, in terms of the Hellenic misunderstanding, it was a result of historical processes like, the Dark Ages. So they lost understanding that needed to be recovered. The problem with modern beliefs is that everyone is starting to build things from the ground up using materialistic tools. So everything they build is bad with a coat of paint, lipstick on a pig and all that.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that people who believe that, or say they believe, I don't know what they believe, who say they believe that the gods are nothing but an excuse for eugenics can be saved. That's a disgusting form of materialism. It's nothing more. There is no divinity there. There is no belief there. There is no piety there. There is no philosophy there. There's nothing there except for materialism. So, again, I would have to say that the crucial line is between materialists and idealists. If you're a materialist, I don't know how you can be saved unless you stop being a materialist. If you look at the myths and you see, sort of a plan to create some sort of eugenic program, I don't think that there's any saving you.
Now, I suppose then I might ask, what might be said of those pagans who are idealists, but of a completely wrong-headed nature? They read the myths, and they see the gods, and they take the myths as a kind of literal statement as to the nature of the gods, that the Iliad and the Odyssey becomes, in a manner, theology. And that's how many people, at least my age, and I'm a rather young man, people at least my age who are polytheists tend to interact with various traditional stories about the gods, is to use them in a manner similar to the Christians using the Bible.
Well, I mean, you already said it, essentially, is that it's essentially just a result of being raised in a fundamentally Christian society. And some people will argue, oh, we don't live in a Christian society. Christianity's on the downturn. Christians will bemoan this, but it's still fundamentally Christian. You can't change the nature of the culture, and it encourages that sort of literalistic thinking. But these are also often people that don't like the idea of being told what to think, what to do, which are, those are fine notions in comparison to the authorities we have now, who you should not be listening to if you can help it. And most teachers and authorities are empty-headed idiots. That is true. But these people think, oh, I can just figure it out myself. I don't need to read Plato. I don't need to read Confucius or Aristotle or read about Orpheus or Pythagoras or Zarathustra or Gautama Siddhartha. You don't need to read about any of those. I can figure it out for myself. And essentially, most of these people possess the capability to understand the deeper notions behind it. A lot of people can, obviously, because you've seen these conclusions come up time and time again, as I did myself. But the problem is that most of these people aren't. And they, on the outhand, do reject the notion of having a teacher lead someone along to a better understanding.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Gautama because that was his whole thing, doing it on his own. But after whether one accepts that he had real enlightenment or not, after his enlightenment, he started a school to teach people how to do it. So even though he did it on his own, that was, if you accept the narrative, because his teachers were bad. We learned that one of his teachers was a materialist who said, gods are fairy tales, and when you die, it's all blackness. He just had bad teachers.
Yeah.
To think that you're going to do it on your own and achieve enlightenment on your own, I don't think that's a very good idea, because most likely you will not.
Yeah, let's take it further from, the Buddha story, is essentially that even having a bad teacher and realizing, oh, that's a bad teaching, that's still really good, because now you've identified that's not good. You've taken a step towards the truth, rather than, just thinking, oh, this could be true, and engaging in that sort of waffling about, I think is just the worst sort.
And that brings up an interesting statement that tends to get thrown around in some of these circles. And again, these are circles that seem to be by and large made of predominantly very young people around my age. This word universal personal gnosis is this idea that all of these various people run around with their own little portion of the truth, even if they're all contradictory to one another. And you'll hear such statements as "my truth" or something as asinine as that. And that is definitely a problem, because the lack of any structure around the inheritance of these ideas, what it I think leads to is an unwillingness to assert any certainty about what one believes. It becomes just an opinion rather than a belief. And so we might say of these wrong-thinking pagans that they hold opinion, but not belief about something. And that's an important distinction, to hold opinion and not belief.
Well, as Plato did say, knowledge is justified true belief. And these people don't have any justification.
And I don't even think they have belief, really. Just an opinion.
That's a little bit harder to prove.
Well, I will offer my favorite Jesus quote. I have one Jesus quote I really like. By their you shall know them. I really like that thing. So if he really said it, good job, man. That's a good quote. And I cannot tell whether someone has had unverified personal gnosis. That's a claim to enlightenment. I cannot verify it, but I can look at the way they behave afterwards, and I can make judgments on them based on their behavior. And if you behave like an ass, I doubt that you have had enlightenment.
And I think I would agree with that. We're getting a lot of feedback from you, by the way. But I think I would. I think perhaps in that statement I was a little bit too harsh to the idea of unverified personal gnosis. I think I would go. I think I will walk it back just a little bit then, and assert that in and of itself is not an incorrect thing. I think we've all had a moment realized something fundamental, something true that perhaps doesn't show up in one of the important texts, but it has in some way gone on to positively influence the way in which we interact with the world and the way in which we deal with our internal self and our own development. But as you've kind of said, most of this UPG doesn't lead to anything. It's just statements that they kind of throw out there. It potentially is just kind of rationalizing efforts to justify things I already believe, rather than having arrived at new knowledge by means of divine revelation. Which, if we're looking to Iamblichus, we do see that is legitimate divine revelation.
Yes, I think it's even worse with most people today in that it's performative. They are not even trying to justify anything, I think. They're just performing. And it's, especially with younger people. It's a plague. Everyone's trying to project an image outwards, but I doubt that there's anything heartfelt in many cases.
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly with a lot of these activist types, they definitely see paganism or polytheism as a way of essentially striking back against Christianity or Islam or Judaism or colonialism or the West or whatever. But they don't have a genuine interest in the gods or truth, but are rather doing this as a form of contrarianism.
Yes, they take politics and they make something performative by combining it with supposedly religion, so that, on the left you will have people who will say that, paganism is good because decolonializing our minds. And on the right, you will have people saying, oh, look at me, I'm so edgy. Nietzschean paganism, go back to big, strong men killing people because that's paganism. But that's just performative nonsense. It's not, there's nothing there. You're just saying things to sound, to fit in or to sound cool or you're not even going through the process of justifying it to yourself. But maybe I'm too harsh.
Well, I think ultimately their problem, their root problem is that here's how you identify essentially how you identify this bad paganism is they're not prescribing anything. They're not saying, oh, this is what you ought to be doing. They always say vaguely this or vaguely that, like, self-reliance, diversity. But they never say, you ought to perform this sacrifice, you ought to do this moral act. You oughtn't do this immoral act. They never put any framework on anything. It's always this weird amorphous fluid. Though I would think of it more as like a puddle than as a...
Well, I hate to sound like a broken record, but that's the thing. If your mind is poisoned by materialism, you can't really believe in anything. Everything is mud, and that is a Socratic term phrase. They are trapped in muck, and they can't escape. That's what it's like being trapped by materialism. It won't allow you to even believe in anything, to even have any sort of honest approach to anything.
Well, that I think begins to beg the question then. How do we get people out of the muck and the mire of materialism? What is the pathway to their seeing the truth?
I think the first step is to honestly confront them, because I think a lot of these people have gone unconfronted, even by nominal Platonists who shall not be named, because I'm not. This isn't the casting shade stream, but I can think of a particular well-known academic Platonist who has around him a lot of these sorts of non-religious types who ostensibly worship the gods, but I've never seen them actually do anything. And I think essentially that's the problem, is they've just gone unconfronted. Nobody has actually challenged, like, how they believe, and it allows them to essentially run underneath the radar, so to speak. And this isn't about me wanting to impose Platonism on the world yet, but it's just a matter of, like, and that's usually their defense. Like, you just want to impose your way of seeing the world upon me, as just a way to escape any serious trying to understand where they're coming from.
Mm.
And because of this, essentially, they are they are completely unchallenged, so to speak.
Yes, I think I mean, demo, by the way, we're getting a lot of feedback again.
There's a push to talk feature in the voice and video settings.
One of the things I would definitely say in regards to challenging individuals is, and I've spoken about this a little bit on Twitter before, is that I maintain the certainty and the truth of, as I've kind of come to call it, the doctrine and dogma of Plato and the Platonists. I'm not so much of a zealot that I am unwilling to accept a different ontological and metaphysical school of thought within friendly relations, even if, within the realm of disagreement. Said before, I disagree with the Stoics, but I would definitely accept them as a legitimate philosophic tradition, even if I do find their theology and their metaphysics incorrect at certain points. And the same is true, I think, for these, let's use the term activist pagans, and that's what they tend to take the form of, these activist pagans. I would be willing to accept even their left-wing social beliefs, because that's not what we're negating here today. We're negating.
We are an apolitical stream, except for the stuff that occasionally slips through. But
we try to keep it mostly religious. But yeah, I do think that it is worth confronting by just not necessarily in the terms and systems of Platonism, the materialism exhibited by these wrong-thinking pagans, but it is worth confronting materialism as something that is never going to get them really where they need to go. And being able to demonstrate the variety of schools of thought that, though there might be some disagreement, converge on a divine and transcendent truth that is coexistent with the divine, is, I think, key to that. The ability to point and look and go, well, look at these traditions from all of these different parts of the world. They all converge on the same transcendent truth. That's part of it, and then being able to elucidate various reasons why that those things arrive there, and then to challenge at a fundamental level their received empiricistic notions of truth. And that's one of the biggest things, is challenging where they receive truth from.
I think that to take it back to the beginning, this idea that the gods are imperfect and that's good, actually, and all of the problems that we're discussing hinge on the fact that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of pagan religion.
Yeah.
pagan religion is based around the community worshipping together, and we don't have that. So, in its absence, we have people spouting whatever online. But that's not what pagan religion is built around. Pagan religion is built around the community getting together and worshipping. And in order for that worship to be efficacious, in order for it to be good, to work, the community has to have a generally pious attitude, in that you can have a community of materialists, you can have a community of people who fundamentally don't don't think anything of the gods, and don't, in their everyday life, they don't admit the gods in. You can't have a community of worshippers, and we don't have that. We have atheists, and we have Christians, and we have a whole mess, and people online saying stupid things about the gods. So in this kind of environment, it is natural that you will have ideas like the ones we're discussing proliferate, as opposed to, general piety. And in order to have general piety, you have to have a community of worshippers. And I think that we will not really get anywhere until we get that, in terms of the masses. But in terms of that's why I like Platonism. In terms of holding correct opinions about the gods, you can do that in the comfort of your own home, quite far.
So the problem it then goes back to the eternal lack of a community, and I think that it does seem consistently to be the source of most problems we continue to have. Something that we are hopefully rectifying in a certain time frame.
Yes, and many communities that arise around, cult leaders and people who, what they really want is something other than forming a religious community for reasons of piety and worship. They want, money, or to have sex with disciples or whatnot. I think that even because, as I said, the environment is poisoned, you get poisoned fruit. You get, even the communities that are formed are bad. I don't mean to sound overly pessimistic, but I think it's a fact that we're living in the depths of the Bronze Age, and everything is bad, and we have to work with that, unfortunately, until the cycle changes.
And I think some amount of pessimism is entirely normal in the given situation. I remain more or less optimistic, though. I do see the occasional good religious pagan community pop up.
I would say, the fact that you have these impious curs popping up these huge, incredibly centralized communities so easily, I think that's reason to be optimistic in a manner, because it proves it's not very hard. We just need to try. Like, actually. I think we definitely have a problem of us, is that we theory craft too much.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be nice if we did this? Why don't we do it?
And that is in some ways the fault of the nature of our temperaments. But that is definitely a problem.
Philosophers would not end well.
No, it wouldn't. There's a reason that Plato jokes about, to some extent, that philosophers are kind of useless.
We're too busy arguing with each other to actually do anything.
That's true.
But I do think, and we've begun more serious talks about this to some extent, but it is worth really being seriously making something some sort of group that nominally offers something to the people. And I think maybe that's what we've kind of arrived at, that we see these hordes of lost young men and women out there who ostensibly
And
could be
old.
made into good,
There's also
honest
old
pagans.
men and women
Well,
out
of
there
course,
too.
but
There is no barrier for belief.
no, of course not, of course not. But just to draw on that kind of hopeful illusions, I think it is worth having arrived at this to think more seriously on where we shall arrive on this sort of thing in the future, and how and what we can offer to the sort of masses of people who desire religiosity and reject the Abrahamic religions and don't fall for nonsense cults, but are wayward.
Yeah, like in place of that, you have essentially these non-leaders, your activist types, who essentially say broad platitudes and people follow them. And if we were to actually put something out there, like I suppose that's kind of the reason why people, are attracted to Butler, even though I don't think he's a particularly great Platonist, is that he makes statements. Like, he has declarative things about what you should and should not do, even if I think they're a bit limp-wristed at times.
But it is something at the very least.
Yeah.
So
very good. He has done very good work on the Egyptian gods. I just like to add.
Yeah.
Very illuminating his writings on the Egyptian gods.
Yeah, the Egyptian gods are a subject of its own, which we will not be talking about today because it's too extensive. I guess we already talked about Set last time, but that's
that was a pretty good one. So just to plug that one, I'd recommend everyone listening to this one to go listen to our last talk.
You should check out Aloysius and Hermes, E-Politeia. It's a pretty good podcast. I guess it's a podcast.
In some ways.
But yeah. I feel like another big problem of the lack of community, we've completely gone off the stated topic, but that's neither here nor there, is you have like these harsh divisions between pantheons.
Yeah, pantheon is
just pantheon centrism. There needs to be some term like that sounds like vaguely
critical of it.
Yeah, vague, like that sort of activist terminology. I hate it, but I love it at the same time. Pantheon centrism or something. I don't know, that doesn't sound obnoxious enough. But that's definitely like a serious problem where people get like this chauvinism about, their particular pantheon of gods. And don't like to mix around. And so naturally, you don't see a lot of Hermetic pagans, talking about Plato. You don't see a lot of, Hellenics talking about Zoroaster. And you don't see Celtic pagans
doing anything.
You don't see them do anything because they don't exist. You don't see Germanic pagans talking about really anything philosophical because they have nothing except Tacitus, which was a Roman.
And to that extent, I actually think that those traditions that lack ancient thinkers or ancient wisdom that has failed to have been passed down by any number of reasons really should draw intellectuals into it to create those works, to create those intellectual projects to really flesh out the understanding of their own.
Yeah, like a dream project of mine would be like a pan-Hellenization of all the myths ever. You know, just take them all, put them in one book, Interpretio Graeca, them all. And it is a unified system, so to speak.
Yeah, and there is some worth in simply out and out defeating these harsh distinctions. It's worth
and
it's only worth maintaining them insofar as it's worth pointing out the historical distinctions of pantheons.
I mean, I, as many people know, am a big advocate of you've got to understand it all. To understand it all is that you cannot achieve perfect knowledge through the observations of the mythical character of one people.
Yeah, you've got to look everywhere.
Yeah, Platonism was not purely Hellenic. It was
a bunch of things.
Yeah. It was Iranic, Mesopotamian, Phoenician, Egyptian, maybe some ancient Hispanic,
Basques and the like. And
yeah. We don't know, but we do know is that all the antecedents to Platonism were from all these varieties of things. I mean, hell, Orphism was definitely not Greek.
Almost certainly not.
Thracian. Maybe even Dacian in its pure root origin. And it was, very vociferously adopted by many Greeks, but not enough.
To draw this back to our original topic of conversation, these sort of harsh pantheonic distinctions is something we tend to see in these wrong-headed pagans who derive just sort of, as we've kind of said, a certain boastfulness about their ancestors' pantheons.
And regardless of political affiliation too, they'll just name something different. People will talk about culturally appropriating a god as if that's even a thing. It's ridiculous.
I mean, it is worth noting that certain closed traditions do exist, but that's a different thing.
Yeah. Oh, were you going to speak?
No, I was going to say that that's the thing, that there aren't enough living traditions to justify this attitude. If you are, I don't know, a Lakota, a shaman or whatever, and you have in your hands the shamanic knowledge of the Lakota people or your particular tribe of Lakota people, passed down throughout generations, I can understand having some reticence towards accepting some universalist attitudes. Although in that position, I would think that most people in that position would say, oh, this is similar to what we say, therefore it's good, and therefore I should listen to you. Because that's the thing with traditions. If they're uncorrupted traditions, they should agree with each other. But today, we don't have that. We have clowns who got together on a message board in 2003, and then they moved to Twitter in 2015. And that's how their religion started. And that's not... You can't say that, oh, I don't want to engage with other traditions when you don't have a tradition, you don't practice a tradition yourself.
It is a bit tough to say I don't engage with other traditions when you're not engaging with a tradition.
Yes, that's what I mean.
Yeah, but I mean, there is something to be said about trying to bring in even these still existent traditions. I think is that they certainly do possess some sort of truth, like the Anishinaabe, who I think ought to be considered the Chaldean oracles of the West, as they're essentially a religion. They have their religion is based around their own set of oracles and prophecies, and have it's not a Midwewin, I think is how it's said. I don't remember. Is you've got essentially these essentially Platonic notions of the world, but found across the sea. And I think there's something to be understood from these people.
Yes, I think that I would say, of course, I'm a Platonist, and people who are not will say, of course, you'd say that because you're a Platonist. But obviously, I believe that the fundaments of reality are Platonic, and therefore, any good tradition is, in a manner of speaking, Platonic throughout the world. But the thing is that these traditions need to be uncorrupted in order to put some force behind someone saying that I don't engage with other traditions. If if you don't have access to the uncorrupted teachings of that tradition, you're not in a position to reject anything, because the only thing that is informing your views is the philosophy, the dominant philosophy of the modern age, which is materialism and atheism at its core. So people, for example, who say, "Oh, I reject philosophy. Philosophy is bad," and I have heard this from many, Germanic type pagans. They are engaging in the dominant philosophy of the age, materialism, and ultimately atheism and nihilism, without implicitly. So they are engaged in philosophy, just the most irreligious, the worst kind of philosophy possible. So you can't really say that you don't engage with philosophy or you don't engage with other traditions unless you are embedded in a tradition. And to be embedded in a tradition means that you automatically reject the modern philosophy and the modern ethos. Of course, you're not a materialist if you are part of an ancient tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, oh. But yeah, a lot of these people, they always make claims to being part of some sort of thing,
Maybe like the Wiccans.
Yes, they're definitely a problem.
Yeah, I doubt the claims of the Wiccans about the survival of witchcraft.
I wouldn't even call them polytheists. I just call them just ridiculous. They're silly.
They're not. They're depending on how you're gonna read some of their ideas, they're either gonna be some kind of monotheist or duotheist. Some of them think there's just kind of a singular divine femininity, and some of them think there's a divine femininity and then a divine masculinity. And
I call them silly.
Yeah, they are.
They're just silly. They're not even worth engaging with. We need to bring back the pyres. The Romans had the right idea about witches. That's all I can say.
But yes, Wicca is just born out of the 19... Fun fact as well, Wicca was an attempt to recreate the pre-Christian Celtic religion. That was the intended goal.
Yes, but that's the thing, you have these Westerners who come up with something and they say that, this is a recreation of the original, but I don't know, it's like theosophy. Theosophists, we are Buddhists, but will a Buddhist scholar admit them with all the Baroque ideas about this and that? I don't know, I think some Buddhists accept them, some don't, but it's clear that you're dealing with Westerners who just made up some shit, not with people who are genuinely in contact with the tradition. And I say this because, again, I look at what they have created and it's not good. If they had created something good, I would say, yeah, there might be something there. But I generally don't see good things being done.
Theosophy was also founded in the UK. What is it with Britain and founding these ridiculous religions?
the 19th century was an awkward time for the United Kingdoms.
19th century salons were a big thing, and there were mediums were huge. Everyone would go to a medium and talk to the dead, do necromancy and whatever. And most of them were fraudulent, of course. But I think that there's a connection to theosophy in that I think it was a group of spiritists.
Yeah,
And
well,
then they claimed that, we have recovered the original tradition, and they tried to connect it to Platonism because they say that theosophy, the name theosophy, comes from Ammonius Saccas, who was obviously the teacher of Plotinus. And they say that this is the original Platonic tradition and also the original Buddhist tradition, and we are restoring them. A claim which I highly doubt.
I would be very surprised if Plato was a theosophist.
Yeah, I don't think he would much look on the writings of Helen Blavatsky and see anything worthwhile.
I mean, I'm looking at their symbol, and it just looks like a very typical hodgepodge you see in a lot of these, bad pagans. Like, we've got, swastika, Star of David.
The Star of David, the Ankh, the Ouroboros.
I always pronounce it as Ouroboros.
I've always heard it Ouroboros.
Yes, the correct is Ouroboros.
But yes, these all wrong-headed traditions all tie into the fundamental fault of failing to tap into the transcendent and the transcendently true, thanks in part to just rejection of these kind of pieces of the truth that we have received down the ages. And I think then, as we are tend to do here on these talks, we rather important internal notions for what we ought to do and what we ought to come to think of ourselves and what we ought to come to understand of what is needed of us. I think we've kind of come to the position that, at least to some extent, we must begin to work on some sort of outreach program at the very least, or produce some extant material that we can go, well, look here, this is us.
It is a responsibility of those who know to teach.
And I think that's what we've arrived at in discussing the problems of these wrong-headed ideas.
I agree, but the number one problem that anyone doing this today faces, and everyone will admit this, is gatekeeping.
Yeah.
And a lot of people will obviously say that gatekeeping is bad in many circles, but that's what you must do because, as I said, we live in the Iron Age, and people who come in will predominantly be bad. So
they will be brittle and common, like the metal.
Yeah. Yes. The primary work of creating anything worthwhile in our times is keeping the bad people out, I think.
Or at least making them good, ideally.
Yeah. But I think that's a bit harder, at least at the present. But in some ways, we are perhaps blessed in that we can gatekeep solely by virtue of the amount of reading that one needs to do to gain any amount of standing in terms of theological and metaphysical discussions.
Yes, that's the problem of not having a communal worship, because with the communal worship you have people showing up for the sacrifice and the worship, and then if you are inclined to figure out how to fix yourself philosophically, you can do that. But now we don't have the communal worship, so the only avenue for people is to go at it intellectually, which is very, very hard. That is why so many people believe so many stupid things.
Yes. I think a good step would be making a primer, because a lot of people think, oh, I can just go straight to Plotinus.
Really
that's just such a mistake. And Aristotle isn't particularly readable either. but for different reasons.
That's why Sallust exists. That's why On the Gods the World exists. So you can read that. If you don't like that, don't go any further because it gets more Platonic from there.
And that's probably a good introductory text, but I think Scald had a while back this plan for a primer that never got off the ground, and I think we may want to think about revisiting it.
It never got off the ground because none of you people did anything about it. I was ready to go.
Well, however it might be, it never ended up getting off the ground. That said, I think we are at a point, at least I am, in some ways, to kind of begin some project of worth. Although that said, I think we are beginning to reach our natural conclusion on the topic, having discussed the problems and as I want to do towards the end of these things. I think it might be said then in closing that where we've arrived to is that the ills of the wrong-headed pagan is not the ills of the atheist, but is simply the problem of an inferior time in which greatness of tradition has not made it to us, in which we are without our communities, in which we must take great pains to ensure that goodness is preserved, that materialism is confronted, and that those whom have the potential to truly connect with the divine be led there to some extent.
Or we could just blame Martin Luther,
Well,
that would be the easy route.
Well, I'm sure we can blame him too, but
the two are not mutually exclusive.
yes, we can throw Martin Luther under the bus just as well. But,
you should blame the Germans.
I don't know. Let's not be racist. I have many German friends. Let's not.
I am not racist. I have many barbarian friends.
No, I like blaming the Germans as well, but some of them are nice.
My slave is a Thracian, in fact.
But I think we've kind of hit where we need to hit, and I think we've kind of reached our natural conclusion.
Yeah, so I think that was pretty decent. It reminds us the necessity to actually get off our asses, and as much as we like to philosophize in our group chat, that's not really being productive, if I'm being honest.
Oh, yeah, unfortunately, and we must become productive. That's a long-standing issue.
Yeah, well, I would say that if you in your daily life have a worshipful attitude towards the divine and actually worship, that will push you to action in and of itself. Because action is something that the gods want from us. So, well, I wouldn't say want because they don't want anything. They talking about these things is always difficult. It's something that
it is good to do. It's virtuous. Let's say that.
It is good to do action. The gods are good, and in being like the gods, you shall do action.
Yes, that's the correct way to state it. Yes.
But with that, I think I will say thank you, everyone, for your time, and I was very glad to have you here today, Timo. You are always a joy to speak to, and as you as well, Scald. And I wish you all a very good day.
All right. We will see you next week, probably, with something else.
Most certainly.
Wiedersehen.